The billionaire CEO's son hadn't eaten in 3 weeks until the maid's daughter saw something that shocked everyone. Just before we start, I'm curious. What time is it where you are? Day or night, I'm grateful you're here. The September sun cast golden rays through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bennett mansion, illuminating what should have been a picture of perfection. Instead, the massive dining room felt like a hospital ward. Plates of untouched food lined the mahogany table, scrambled eggs growing cold, pancakes stiffening, fresh fruit wilting under the crystal chandelier. 7-year-old Christopher Bennett sat motionless in his chair, his small frame seeming to shrink with each passing day. His blonde hair, once vibrant and full of life, now looked dull against his increasingly pale skin. Dark circles had formed under his blue eyes, making him look far older than his years. His superhero pajamas, Spider-Man, his favorite, hung loose on his thinning body. "Christopher, please!" His father, Richard Bennett, knelt beside the chair, his voice cracking with desperation. At 38, Richard was one of the youngest tech CEOs in Silicon Valley, a man who'd built a billion-dollar empire through determination and intellect. But all his success, all his money, all his connections meant nothing in this moment. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't fix his son. "Just one bite, buddy. Just one." Richard held up a spoonful of oatmeal, his hand trembling slightly. "It's your favorite, with honey and cinnamon, just like Mom used to make it." "Deal." At the mention of his late mother, Christopher's eyes glistened with tears, but he turned his head away, his lips pressed into a thin line. It had been 2 years since the car accident that took Sarah Bennett, and Richard had been trying his best to be both parents. But how could he parent a child who was slowly starving himself to death? Doctor Morrison, the 5th specialist Richard had brought to the mansion this month, stood near the window, clipboard in hand, watching the scene with growing concern. The elderly pediatrician had 40 years of experience, but Christopher's case baffled him completely. "Mr. Bennett, doctor," Morrison said quietly, "I really think we need to consider hospitalization. 3 weeks without proper nutrition. His body is starting to show dangerous signs. His blood work came back this morning, and his electrolytes are critically imbalanced." "No hospitals," Richard said firmly, though his voice wavered. He's terrified of hospitals. After what happened with Sarah, the ambulances, the emergency room, he couldn't finish the sentence. "If we force him there, it might make things worse." "But if we don't," Dr. Morrison began. "I know." Richard stood abruptly, running his hands through his dark hair. "Don't you think I know? I've had nutritionists, psychologists, pediatricians, specialists from Johns Hopkins, everyone. No one can tell me what's wrong with my son." In the corner of the room, barely noticed by the adults, stood Maria Santos, the mansion's head housekeeper. She'd worked for the Bennett family for 8 years, long enough to remember when this house was filled with laughter instead of desperation. Her weathered hands clutched a dustcloth, but she hadn't moved in minutes, her eyes fixed on the heartbreaking scene before her. Beside Maria, holding tightly to her mother's uniform skirt, was 6-year-old Alice Santos. While the adults argued and Christopher stared blankly at the untouched food, Alice's dark eyes were studying everything with an intensity that seemed unusual for such a young child. She'd been coming to work with her mother during summer break, and for the past week she'd been watching Christopher with fascination, not the morbid kind, but genuine curiosity. Alice was small for her age, with long dark braids that her mother wove fresh each morning. Her brown skin glowed with health, a stark contrast to Christopher's pallor. She wore a simple yellow dress, one of only 3 she owned, but she wore it with unconscious pride. Unlike Christopher, who had every toy and game money could buy, Alice had learned to find wonder in observation, in noticing the small details others missed. "Mr. Bennett, doctor." Morrison tried again. "There's a children's hospital in Boston with an eating disorder unit that..." He doesn't have an eating disorder, Richard interrupted. He's not anorexic. He's not bulimic. He just stopped. He stopped eating 3 weeks ago, and no one can tell me why. The desperation in Richard's voice echoed through the cavernous room. This was a man used to having answers, used to solving problems with money or connections or sheer force of will. But his 7-year-old son was fading away before his eyes, and he was powerless. Christopher continued to stare at the table, his expression blank. It wasn't defiance. Richard had dealt with his son's stubborn phases before. This was different. It was as if Christopher wanted to eat but couldn't, as if some invisible wall stood between him and the food, a barrier no one else could see. Maybe if we tried video games during meals, Richard suggested desperately. Or we could eat outside, by the pool. Christopher, would you like that? We could have a picnic, just like we used to do with Mum. A single tear rolled down Christopher's cheek, but still he didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much at all since this started, just shook his head or nodded, communicating in the smallest gestures possible, as if even words required too much energy. Dr. Morrison made a note on his clipboard. The psychological evaluation from Dr. Chen suggests possible trauma response, perhaps related to his mother's death, manifesting in delayed onset. But that doesn't explain the sudden nature of this, or why traditional therapy approaches aren't working. Then what does explain it? Richard demanded. What am I missing? From her corner, Alice tugged on her mother's skirt. Mama, she whispered in Spanish, so quietly that only Maria could hear. Mama, I think I know. Shh, mija, Maria whispered back, gently pressing Alice behind her. Not now. This isn't our place. But Alice didn't stop watching. While Dr. Morrison discussed feeding tubes and intravenous nutrition, while Richard's shoulders sagged under the weight of his helplessness, Alice's eyes remained fixed on Christopher. She was seeing something, understanding something, piecing together a puzzle that existed in plain sight. The morning stretched on with the same painful pattern. Richard tried different foods: toast, cereal, yogurt, fruit smoothies. Christopher rejected everything, sometimes with a small shake of his head, other times by simply closing his eyes, as if the sight of food physically pained him. By noon, Richard had to leave for an emergency board meeting. Even his absence couldn't halt the demands of running a tech empire. Dr. Morrison left with him, promising to consult with colleagues at Harvard Medical School. The mansion fell into its new, terrible routine, quiet desperation punctuated by futile attempts to coax Christopher to eat. Maria returned to her duties, though her heart ached with every step she took away from that dining room. She'd known Christopher since he was born, had watched him grow from a chubby, happy baby into a bright, energetic boy who asked endless questions and gave the warmest hugs. Seeing him like this, so hollow and withdrawn, broke something in her that no amount of dusting or cleaning could fix. Alice, however, had a different plan. When her mother went upstairs to clean the bedrooms, Alice slipped back toward the dining room. Christopher was still there now alone, except for Margaret, the day nurse Richard had hired. Margaret was typing on her phone, making notes about Christopher's non-existent food intake. "You should try to rest, sweetheart," Margaret said kindly to Christopher, though she'd learned not to expect a response. "Your father will be home soon." Christopher didn't react, just continued staring at the table with those haunted eyes. Margaret sighed and stepped out to take a phone call, leaving the boy alone in the vast room. That's when Alice made her move. She approached Christopher's chair slowly, the way you might approach a scared animal. She'd learned from her mother that sometimes kindness needed to be quiet, gentle, patient. "Hi, Christopher," she said softly, standing a respectful distance away. "My name is Alice. My mama works here cleaning. I've been watching you." Christopher's eyes flickered toward her, the first real acknowledgement he'd given anyone all morning. Something about Alice's directness, her lack of pity or pressure, seemed to reach him in a way the adults couldn't. "Everyone thinks you don't want to eat," Alice continued, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. But I don't think that's true. I think you do want to eat. You just can't, and nobody can figure out why. Christopher's lower lip trembled. He nodded just barely, but it was there. Acknowledgement, communication, a crack in the wall. Alice took a step closer. Can I tell you something? I notice things other people don't see. My mama says I'm too curious for my own good. She smiled a little, but I think maybe my curiosity could help you. Would that be okay? Another small nod. Christopher's eyes were fully on her now, searching her face for something. Maybe hope, maybe understanding, maybe just someone who saw him as something other than a problem to be solved. I've been watching you during breakfast, during lunch, when they bring you snacks, Alice said. She moved closer still, until she was standing right beside his chair. And I noticed something really interesting, something about the colors. Christopher's eyes widened. It was the most expression Alice had seen on his face since she'd arrived at the mansion a week ago. His whole body seemed to tense, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she'd just spoken a secret password only he knew. The colors? Christopher whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. They were the first words he'd spoken in days. Alice nodded eagerly. Yes, the colors of the food. You don't just look at food like other people do. You look at it different, and I think, she paused, considering her words carefully, I think maybe the colors are wrong somehow. For you, I mean. Not wrong for everyone, but wrong for you. A tear escaped Christopher's eye and rolled down his pale cheek. Nobody else sees it, he whispered. Nobody else understands. And I see it, Alice said firmly. Well, I see that you're seeing something different, and I want to understand. Will you help me understand? For the first time in 3 weeks, Christopher Bennet smiled. It was small, wavering, fragile as a soap bubble, but it was real. And in that smile, Alice saw the beginning of an answer to a mystery that had stumped the most educated minds money could hire. But the answer was more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined, and sharing it would require a courage that even Alice, with all her wonderful curiosity, wasn't sure she possessed. Because the truth about Christopher's silent hunger wasn't just about food or colors or medical conditions. It was about the way a young boy's mind worked, about perceptions that didn't fit the normal world, about a gift disguised as a curse. And it was about to turn everything in the Bennet mansion upside down. Christopher glanced at the door, where Margaret had disappeared, then back at Alice. "Can you keep a secret?" he whispered. "Yes," Alice promised immediately, crossing her heart with her small finger. "Always." "The food," Christopher's voice was barely audible. "The food is screaming at me." Alice tilted her head, not understanding yet, but not dismissing either. "Screaming? The colors. They're too loud, too bright, too wrong." Christopher's words came faster now, tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. "Everything they give me is red or orange or brown, and those colors, they hurt, Alice. They hurt my eyes and my brain, and when I try to eat them, it's like putting something burning in my mouth, even though I know they're not really hot. But nobody believes me because the food isn't really screaming. It's just, to me, it is." Alice listened with intense focus, her young mind working to process what Christopher was telling her. She didn't have the vocabulary for what she was hearing. Words like synesthesia or sensory processing disorder were beyond her 6 years. But she understood the essential truth. Christopher was experiencing something real, even if others couldn't see it. "What about other colors?" Alice asked. "What about blue food or green or purple?" Christopher's eyes lit up with a desperate hope. "I don't know. They don't give me those colors. Everything is always red apples and orange carrots and brown toast and yellow eggs, and those colors make me feel sick before I even taste anything." Alice thought hard, her forehead wrinkling with concentration. She remembered her mother's kitchen at their small apartment across town, remembered meals that were different from the fancy food served in the Bennet mansion. "Wait here," she said suddenly, and before Christopher could respond, she darted out of the dining room. Christopher sat alone, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone had listened to him. Not just heard his words, but truly listened, believed him, taken him seriously. And that someone was a 6-year-old girl he barely knew. Minutes passed. Christopher heard Margaret's footsteps returning and quickly wiped his eyes, resuming his blank expression. Margaret entered, checked her watch, and made another note on her chart. "Still nothing, honey?" Christopher shook his head, and Margaret sighed deeply. Then Alice reappeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, carrying something wrapped in a napkin. She glanced at Margaret, who was now focused on her phone again, and quickly slipped to Christopher's side. "Look," Alice whispered, unwrapping the napkin to reveal a handful of blueberries she'd taken from the kitchen. "Try these. They're blue. Very blue." Christopher stared at the berries as if they were precious jewels. His hand trembled as he reached out, picked up one small blueberry, and examined it. Alice held her breath, watching, hoping, praying to any saint her mother had ever taught her about. Christopher brought the blueberry closer to his face. He studied its deep blue-purple color, so different from the reds and oranges and browns that had been torturing him. And then, slowly, carefully, he put it in his mouth. Alice watched his face transform. It was like watching the sun rise. Slow at first, then suddenly brilliant. Christopher's eyes went wide, then closed, and when he swallowed, a sound escaped him that was half laugh, half sob. "It's quiet," he whispered. "Alice, it's quiet. The color is quiet." Without thinking, without hesitation, Christopher grabbed another blueberry, then another, eating them with a hunger that was 3 weeks deep. Alice's face broke into a huge grin, and she had to cover her mouth to keep from squealing with joy. Margaret looked up from her phone. "Christopher, are you— oh my God, he's eating. He's actually eating." She rushed over, staring in disbelief at the sight of Christopher Bennet consuming food for the first time in 21 days. "What did you give him?" Margaret demanded, though her tone was more ecstatic than accusatory. "What is that?" "Blueberries," Alice said simply. "Just blueberries." "But we tried blueberries last week. He wouldn't touch them." "Not like these," Alice said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she meant. Maybe it was the way she'd offered them, without pressure or expectation. Maybe it was that she'd listened first, or maybe, just maybe, it was that she'd believed in what Christopher was experiencing instead of trying to fix it according to what adults thought should work. Margaret immediately grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed. Mr. Bennet, you need to come home right now. Christopher is eating." "Yes, eating. I don't understand it myself, but yes, hurry." Christopher finished the last blueberry and looked at Alice with eyes that, for the first time in weeks, held light instead of shadows. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me, Alice. You really saved me." But Alice knew the truth wasn't quite that simple. She'd found one piece of the puzzle, sure, but there were more pieces to discover. Why did certain colors affect Christopher this way? What did it mean? How could they help him navigate a world that wasn't built for the way his mind worked? The sound of car tires screeching on the driveway announced Richard Bennet's arrival. He burst through the front door and into the dining room, his expensive suit disheveled, his hair wild, his face a mixture of hope and terror. "Christopher." He knelt beside his son's chair, taking in the sight of empty blueberry stems, the small stains on Christopher's pajamas, the color, actual color, returning to his son's cheeks. "You ate? You really ate?" Christopher nodded, then did something he hadn't done in 3 weeks. He reached out and hugged his father, burying his face in Richard's shoulder. Richard's arms wrapped around his son, and he began to cry. Great. heaving sobs of relief and gratitude and overwhelming love. "How?" Richard managed to ask, looking up at Margaret, then at Alice, this small girl he'd barely noticed before. "How did this happen?" Alice?" Margaret said, gesturing to the little girl who was trying to make herself small in the corner, suddenly aware that she'd inserted herself into something much bigger than she'd intended. She gave him blueberries, and he just started eating. Richard looked at Alice with an expression she'd never seen directed at her before. Pure, profound gratitude mixed with desperate curiosity. "Alice, honey, how did you know? How did you know blueberries would work?" Alice shifted uncomfortably, suddenly shy under the weight of this powerful man's full attention. I just noticed that Christopher looks at food different, and he told me about the colors, how they hurt him, so I thought maybe different colors might not hurt, and blue is very different from red and orange and brown." Richard stared at her, then at his son, then back at her. "He told you about the colors?" The food screams at him," Alice said simply. "The wrong colors scream, but the blue ones are quiet." Richard Bennett, billionaire CEO, a man who'd negotiated deals with heads of state and tech giants, who'd revolutionized the software industry before he was 30, found himself completely speechless. In all his consultations with experts, no one had asked Christopher about colors. No one had thought to listen to what the world looked like through his son's eyes, but a 6-year-old girl with no education beyond first grade had figured it out in a week. "Christopher," Richard said softly, still holding his son, "is this true? Do colors hurt you?" Christopher nodded against his father's shoulder. "Some colors, not all, just some, and nobody believed me when I tried to tell them, so I stopped trying." Richard's heart broke and mended simultaneously. His son had been suffering, trying to communicate something profound, and in the chaos of medical consultations and expert opinions, no one had truly heard him. They'd heard words, but hadn't listened to meaning. "I believe you," Richard said firmly. "I believe you, and we're going to figure this out together. Whatever is happening, whatever makes certain colors feel wrong to you, we'll understand it. I promise." He looked up at Alice, this remarkable little girl who'd accomplished what dozens of specialists couldn't. "Alice, would you and your mother please stay? I'd like to talk to you both. I have a feeling we have a lot to learn from you." Alice nodded, though she was still nervous. Maria appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by Margaret, her face a mixture of pride and concern. She'd taught her daughter to be helpful, to be observant, but she'd never imagined Alice would become central to the Bennett family's crisis. As Richard continued to hold his son, as Margaret called Dr. Morrison with the breakthrough news, as Maria clutched her daughter's hand with both gratitude and trepidation, the September sun continued to pour through those massive windows. But now, instead of illuminating despair, it lit hope. Christopher Bennett was eating again. Not much yet, just a handful of blueberries, but it was a beginning. And sometimes in the darkest times, a beginning is everything. But this was only the start of the mystery. The question of why Christopher experienced colors so intensely, why his brain processed the visual world differently than others, remained unanswered. And the path to understanding would reveal secrets about the human mind that would change not just the Bennett family, but potentially thousands of children like Christopher, children whose different perceptions made them seem broken when they were, in fact, extraordinarily unique. Alice didn't know it yet, but her simple act of observation and kindness had set in motion a series of events that would transform lives, challenge medical understanding, and prove that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from years of study, but from the clear, unprejudiced eyes of a child who simply chose to see. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the Bennett mansion as Richard made a decision that would change everything. He cancelled all his meetings for the rest of the week, instructed his assistant to handle emergencies only, and dedicated himself entirely to understanding his son's mysterious condition. Dr. Morrison returned within the hour, accompanied by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neurologist specializing in pediatric sensory processing disorders. Dr. Rodriguez was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a practical bun. Unlike the other specialists who'd paraded through the mansion, she arrived with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined diagnoses. "Christopher," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, sitting across from him at the dining table, "your father tells me that certain colors of food cause you discomfort. Can you tell me more about that?" Christopher glanced at Alice, who gave him an encouraging nod from where she sat with Maria near the doorway. Richard had insisted they stay, recognizing that Alice had somehow become Christopher's translator, his bridge to the adult world. "It's hard to explain," Christopher began, his voice still weak but steadier than before. "When I see red food like apples or strawberries, it's like the color is too loud. It feels like it's shouting at me. And orange is even worse. Carrots, oranges, cheese. They make me feel sick just looking at them." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, making notes but maintaining eye contact. "And what about the blueberries? What made them different?" "They were quiet," Christopher said simply. "Blue is peaceful. It doesn't hurt." "Fascinating," Dr. Rodriguez murmured. "Tell me, Christopher, has this always been true for you? Have colors always felt this way?" Christopher thought for a moment, his brow furrowing with concentration. "I think so, but it got worse after Mom died. Everything got louder then. Colors, sounds, even smells. It was like someone turned up the volume on the whole world." Richard's hand tightened on his son's shoulder. He'd known grief had affected Christopher, but he hadn't realized the extent to which his son's entire sensory experience had been transformed by trauma. "That makes sense, Doctor," Rodriguez said. "Extreme stress or trauma can sometimes intensify existing sensory sensitivities. Christopher, I believe you might have what's called synesthesia, combined with heightened sensory processing sensitivity. It means your brain processes sensory information, like colors, differently than most people. The colors aren't just visual information for you. They carry emotional or even physical sensations." "So he's not making it up?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. "This is real. Absolutely real," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed. "Synesthesia affects about 4% of the population, though it manifests differently in each person. For Christopher, it seems visual stimuli, particularly certain colors, trigger strong physiological responses. When combined with trauma-related sensory amplification, it became unbearable." Maria squeezed Alice's hand, pride and amazement washing over her. Her 6-year-old daughter had identified something that medical professionals had missed. "But why didn't anyone figure this out before?" Richard demanded, frustration creeping into his voice. "We've had specialists here for weeks." "Because," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, "most medical professionals, myself included, rely on standard assessment protocols. We ask about appetite, mood, physical pain, standard questions that yield standard answers. But Christopher's experience is far from standard. He needed someone to ask the right question, or rather, to observe without the filter of medical training." She smiled at Alice. "Young lady, you have a remarkable gift for observation. You saw what others missed because you weren't looking for what you expected to find. You were simply watching and listening." Alice ducked her head, embarrassed but pleased. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. "And you did," Dr. Rodriguez assured her. "More than you know. Over the next hour, Doctor." Rodriguez conducted a series of gentle tests with Christopher, showing him various colored objects and foods, documenting his reactions. Red and orange items caused visible distress. His breathing quickened. He looked away. His hands trembled. Yellow and brown elicited milder but still negative responses. But blue, purple and green foods brought visible relief. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing normalized, and most importantly, he was willing to eat them. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Rodriguez said, reviewing her notes. "Christopher's synesthesia is particularly strong with warm colors. The neurological pathways that process color are cross-wired with those that process threat or discomfort. Essentially, his brain interprets certain colors as danger signals." "So, what do we do?" Richard asked. "How do we help him?" "Well, short term, we accommodate," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "We provide foods in colors that don't trigger his distress response. Blues, purples, greens, blueberries, purple grapes, green vegetables, certain types of fish. There are more options than you might think." "And long-term?" Richard pressed. "Therapy," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Gradual exposure therapy, combined with trauma counseling to address the amplification caused by his mother's death. We can help Christopher develop coping mechanisms, ways to manage the sensory overload. But Mr. Bennett, I want to be clear. This isn't something we cure. Christopher's brain is simply wired differently. We help him navigate the world as it is, not change who he fundamentally is." Richard looked at his son, seeing him in an entirely new light. Christopher wasn't being difficult or stubborn. He was navigating a world that literally hurt him in ways Richard couldn't fully comprehend. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. "I understand," Richard said quietly. "We adapt. We help him thrive as he is." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Exactly. And Mr. Bennett, many people with synesthesia consider it a gift, not a disability. Some of the world's most creative artists, musicians, and thinkers have had synesthesia. Once Christopher learns to manage it, his unique perception could become a strength." As Dr. Rodriguez packed her materials, Richard turned to Maria and Alice. "Mrs. Santos, Alice, I can't thank you enough. You've given me my son back. If there's anything at all I can do for you, please tell me." Maria shook her head. "Mr. Bennett, we were just glad to help. Alice has a good heart. That's reward enough." But Richard Bennett hadn't built an empire by accepting simple gratitude. His mind was already working, planning, calculating how to properly acknowledge what this little girl had done. "Alice," he said, kneeling to her eye level, "you helped my son when no one else could. That means you're special, very special. Would you like to come visit Christopher sometimes? I think he could use a friend like you." Alice's eyes lit up. She'd never had a friend who lived in a mansion, who had a swimming pool and a game room and all the toys a kid could dream of. But more than that, she'd connected with Christopher in a way that felt important, meaningful. "Can I, Mama?" Alice asked, looking up at her mother. Maria hesitated. The boundary between employer and employee was clear in her mind, and this felt like crossing it. But seeing the hope in both children's eyes, she couldn't refuse. "If Mr. Bennett is sure," Maria began. "I'm absolutely sure," Richard said firmly. "In fact, I'd like to arrange something more permanent. Mrs. Santos, I'd like to offer you a substantial raise, and I'd like to hire Alice as Christopher's companion. Not a job exactly, she's far too young for that, but a role. Someone to help Christopher navigate situations that might be overwhelming for him. Someone who understands him." "Mr. Bennett, that's too much," Maria protested. "It's not nearly enough," Richard interrupted. "Your daughter saved my son's life. Let me do this, please." Maria looked at Alice, at the hope and excitement in her daughter's face, and felt something shift in her world. They'd always struggled financially, always counted pennies, and worried about bills. This could change everything. "Okay," Maria whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Thank you." As Dr. Rodriguez left with instructions for Christopher's care, as Maria and Alice prepared to go home with promises to return the next day, Christopher sat at the dining table with a small bowl of blueberries, purple grapes, and green apple slices. The first meal he'd eaten in 3 weeks. Richard watched his son eat, each bite a small miracle. But he also watched Alice, this remarkable little girl who'd accomplished what expertise and money couldn't. She'd brought more than food to Christopher. She'd brought understanding, acceptance, and friendship. "Dad," Christopher said between bites, "is Alice really going to come back?" "Every day if she wants to," Richard promised. "Would you like that?" Christopher nodded vigorously, more animated than Richard had seen him in months. "She gets it, Dad. She doesn't think I'm weird." "You're not weird," Richard said firmly. "You're extraordinary. And we're going to make sure the world understands that." As the sun set over the Bennett mansion, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Christopher carefully didn't look at, something new took root in that house of grief and wealth, hope, understanding, and the beginning of a friendship that would prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come not in expensive packages, but in the simple act of one child truly seeing another. But challenges remained. How would Christopher navigate school, where cafeterias served food in every color? How would he manage birthday parties, holidays, restaurants, all the colorful chaos of childhood? And what about the deeper trauma, the loss of his mother that had amplified everything? The answers would come slowly and sometimes painfully. But for now, in this moment, Christopher Bennett was eating, and that was enough. Alice waved goodbye from the back seat of her mother's old car, and Christopher waved back from the mansion's grand entrance. Two children from completely different worlds, connected by something deeper than wealth or circumstance. Connected by understanding, by acceptance, by the simple, profound act of being seen. 3 weeks had passed since Alice's discovery, and the Bennett mansion had transformed into something resembling a laboratory. Richard had hired a nutritionist who specialized in creating meals within Christopher's safe color palette, and the kitchen now stocked an array of purple cabbages, blueberries, blackberries, eggplants, blue corn, and green vegetables that Christopher could tolerate. Christopher had gained back some of the weight he'd lost, and color, real color, had returned to his cheeks. But more importantly, he'd gained something else. Alice. Every day after school, Maria would bring Alice to the mansion, and the two children would spend hours together, creating a friendship that defied their different backgrounds. On this particular October afternoon, Alice found Christopher in the mansion's library, surrounded by stacks of books, but staring blankly at a piece of paper in his hands. She recognized that look. It was the same overwhelmed expression he'd worn when he couldn't eat. "What's wrong?" Alice asked, settling into the leather chair beside him. Christopher handed her the paper. It was an invitation to Ryan Mitchell's birthday party, scheduled for the following Saturday. The invitation was decorated with bright red balloons and orange streamers, cheerful to most eyes, but Alice now understood what Christopher saw: visual assault. "Everyone in my class is going," Christopher said quietly. "Ryan's been my friend since kindergarten. But Alice, the party is at Pizza Paradise. Do you know what pizza looks like? Red sauce, orange cheese, brown crust, and birthday cake. It's always bright colors. Pink frosting, yellow cake, red and blue decorations everywhere." Alice studied the invitation, understanding the magnitude of the problem. Christopher hadn't been to school since the eating crisis began. Richard had arranged for private tutoring at home while they figured out how to help Christopher manage his condition in the real world. This party would be Christopher's first real test. "Are you going to go?" Alice asked. "I want to," Christopher admitted. "I miss my friends. I miss being normal, but what if I can't handle it? What if everyone sees me freaking out over pizza and thinks I'm crazy?" "You're not crazy," Alice said firmly. "Your brain just works different. Dr. Rodriguez said that, remember?" That doesn't help when everyone's staring at you because you can't eat birthday cake, Christopher muttered. Alice was quiet for a moment, her young mind working through the problem. She thought about her own birthday parties, simple affairs in their small apartment with her mother's homemade flan and a few friends from the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but full of love and acceptance. "What if I came with you?" Alice suggested suddenly. Christopher looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You'd do that? Why not? I bet your friend Ryan wouldn't mind, and if you have someone there who understands, maybe it won't be so scary." "But Alice, it's not your world," Christopher said, echoing something he'd heard adults say. The invisible line between the wealthy kids at his private school and children like Alice from working-class families. "Everyone there will be from Riverside Academy. They're different." "Different how?" Alice challenged. "They have 2 arms and 2 legs like me, right? They laugh and play and eat pizza. Well, most of them do. I'm not scared of different." Christopher smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time that afternoon. "Okay, I'll ask my dad if you can come. But Alice, you have to promise you won't leave my side. I don't think I can do this without you." "I promise," Alice said, crossing her heart. "We're a team, remember?" That evening, Richard agreed immediately to Alice's attendance at the party. In fact, he was relieved. He'd been dreading Christopher's re-entry into social situations, worried about setbacks, about other children's reactions. Having Alice there felt like a safety net. But Maria had different concerns. That night, in their small apartment across town, she sat Alice down for a serious conversation. "Mija, I need you to understand something," Maria said gently, braiding Alice's hair for bed. "The children at this party, they come from a very different world than ours. They have things we don't have. They might say things that hurt your feelings." "I know, Mama," Alice said. "Christopher told me, but he needs me." "I know he does, and that's beautiful," Maria continued. "But I also need you to remember who you are. You're Alice Santos, and you're just as valuable as any child in that mansion or at that fancy school. Don't let anyone make you feel small." "I won't," Alice promised. But privately, she felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd never been to a party at a place like Pizza Paradise, had never been around so many wealthy children. What if Christopher was right? What if she didn't fit in? Saturday arrived with brilliant autumn sunshine. Maria dressed Alice in her best outfit, a purple dress that Richard had insisted on buying for her, though Maria had protested it was too expensive. Alice loved it because purple was one of Christopher's safe colors, a small gesture of solidarity. When they arrived at Pizza Paradise, the parking lot was filled with expensive cars, Mercedes, BMWs, Teslas. Maria's 15-year-old Honda looked painfully out of place. Inside, the restaurant was the explosion of color and noise, arcade games flashing, children screaming with laughter, decorations in every shade of red, orange, yellow, and pink imaginable. Christopher stood frozen in the entrance, his face already pale. Richard's hand was firm on his shoulder, but Alice could see the panic building in her friend's eyes. "It's okay," Alice whispered, taking Christopher's hand. "Just look at me when it gets too loud. You don't have to look at all the colors." They made their way to the party area, where about 20 children were already gathered. Ryan Mitchell, the birthday boy, ran up immediately. "Christopher, you came. I'm so glad. We've all been worried about you." Ryan was a cheerful boy with freckles and red hair, genuinely happy to see his friend. Then he noticed Alice. "Who's this?" "This is Alice," Christopher said. "She's my friend. She helps me with stuff." "Cool," Ryan said, accepting this without question the way only children can. "Come on, we're about to start laser tag." The next hour was a blur of activity. Alice had never played laser tag before, but she threw herself into it with enthusiasm, protecting Christopher's back as they navigated the darkened maze. The dim lighting actually helped Christopher. Fewer bright colors to process, just the gentle blues and purples of the neon lights. But then came the food portion of the party. The staff brought out pizzas, covered in bright red sauce and orange cheese, just as Christopher had feared. Then came the birthday cake, a massive creation decorated with race cars in red, yellow, and orange frosting. Alice felt Christopher's hand tighten in hers. Around them, children were grabbing slices of pizza, laughing and talking. No one had noticed yet that Christopher wasn't eating, but it was only a matter of time. "Hey, Christopher, want some pizza?" A girl named Madison called out, holding up a particularly bright slice. "No thanks," Christopher mumbled, looking at his lap. "What? Everyone likes pizza." Another boy, Tyler, chimed in. "Are you sick or something?" Alice saw Christopher starting to shut down, that same blank expression from weeks ago returning. She had to do something. "Christopher has special food needs," Alice announced loudly, standing up. "His brain processes colors differently than yours. Bright colors make him feel sick. It's called synesthesia, and it's actually really cool." The group fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to Alice, some curious, some skeptical, some dismissive. She felt her confidence waver, but forced herself to continue. "It means Christopher experiences the world in a special way," Alice explained. "Colors aren't just colors to him. They have feelings and sounds. It's like having a superpower, kind of." "That's weird," Tyler said bluntly. "He can't eat pizza because of colors? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." "It's not dumb," Alice said, her voice rising. "It's science. Doctors explained it and everything. Just because you don't understand something doesn't make it dumb." "Who even are you?" Madison asked, looking Alice up and down in a way that made Alice suddenly very aware of how different she looked from these children in their designer clothes and expensive sneakers. "Do you even go to Riverside?" "No, but—" Alice began. "Then why are you here?" Tyler interrupted. "This is Ryan's party for Riverside kids." "I invited her," Christopher said quietly, but his voice was firm. He stood up beside Alice. "Alice is my best friend. She's the one who figured out what was wrong with me when all the doctors couldn't. She's smarter than anyone I know." "Christopher can't eat the pizza," Alice continued, addressing the group, "but he brought his own food. That's okay, right? People have allergies and stuff all the time." Ryan, the birthday boy, stepped forward. "Yeah, that's totally fine. My cousin has a peanut allergy and has to bring special food to parties. This is kind of like that, right, Christopher?" Christopher nodded gratefully. Richard, who'd been watching from the parents' section, approached with a small cooler he'd brought, packed with blueberries, purple grapes, and a sandwich made with blue corn tortillas and green vegetables. "See?" Alice said, gesturing to the cooler. "Christopher can still eat with everyone. The food is just different colors." Most of the children accepted this and returned to their pizza, but Alice noticed a small group of girls whispering in the corner, occasionally glancing at her and giggling. She tried to ignore it, focusing on helping Christopher feel comfortable with his meal. During the cake cutting, Christopher politely declined, and Alice stood beside him in solidarity, even though she'd been looking forward to birthday cake all week. They sang "Happy Birthday" to Ryan, played a few more arcade games, and Alice thought maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. But as the party was winding down, Madison approached with 2 other girls from her class. "So, Alice," Madison said with false sweetness in her voice, "where do you go to school, since you're not at Riverside?" "Jefferson Elementary," Alice answered, sensing a trap but not sure how to avoid it. "Oh, that's the public school, right?" Madison wrinkled her nose. "My mom says public schools are where kids go when their parents can't afford real education." "Jefferson is a real school," Alice said, her cheeks burning. "My teacher, Mrs. Chen, is really good. We're learning multiplication and everything." We learned multiplication in 1st grade," one of the other girls, Sophia, said smugly. "At Riverside, we're already doing pre-algebra." "Well, good for you," Alice said, trying to keep her voice steady. She remembered her mother's words. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Is that dress from Target? Madison asked, touching the sleeve of Alice's purple dress. It's kind of cheap looking. Alice pulled her arm away, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She'd been so proud of this dress, had felt beautiful in it. Now these girls were making her feel like she didn't belong, like she was less than them because her clothes came from Target instead of wherever they shopped. "Leave her alone," Christopher said, appearing at Alice's side. "That dress is perfect. Purple is one of my favorite colors, and Alice wore it because she knew it would help me feel calm today." "Whatever," Madison said, rolling her eyes. "We were just making conversation. Come on, girls." The group walked away, whispering and giggling. Alice blinked rapidly, fighting tears. She'd known there would be differences, but she hadn't expected this casual cruelty, this making her feel like she wasn't good enough simply because of where she lived and where she went to school. "Don't listen to them," Christopher said fiercely. "Madison's always been mean. She makes fun of everyone who's different from her. Last year, she made a kid cry because his lunchbox had cartoon characters on it." "But they're right, aren't they?" Alice whispered. "I don't belong here. This isn't my world." "You belong anywhere I am," Christopher insisted. "Alice, you saved my life. You're the bravest, smartest person I know. Those girls, they're just mean because they're scared of anyone who's different." Richard appeared then, having witnessed the exchange from a distance. His expression was dark with anger. "Christopher's right, Alice. Those children were being unkind, and it says everything about them and nothing about you." As they left the party, Alice felt emotionally exhausted. The day had been a success in that Christopher had survived it, had managed his condition in public, had eaten his own food without too much embarrassment. But Alice had learned something painful. The world wasn't always kind to people who were different, whether that difference was how your brain processed colors or where your family fell on the economic ladder. In the car ride home, Christopher was quiet, processing his own feelings about the day. Finally, he spoke. "Alice, I'm sorry. I should have warned you better about how some of the kids would be." "It's okay," Alice said, though it wasn't, not really. "I'm glad I went. You needed me there." "I did," Christopher agreed. "But Alice, you needed to be there too, not for me, for you, because now you know you can handle anything. Those girls tried to make you feel small, but you didn't shrink. You stood up for me and for yourself. That's real bravery." Alice considered this. Christopher was right. She had stood up to Madison. She had explained synesthesia to a room full of strangers. She had stayed strong even when people made her feel unwelcome. Maybe that counted for something. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard asked Maria and Alice to stay for dinner. Over a meal carefully prepared in Christopher's safe colors, Richard made an announcement. "I've been thinking about Christopher's return to school," he said, "and I've decided to make some changes. I'm going to meet with Riverside Academy's administration and insist they provide accommodations for Christopher's condition. Classroom modifications, cafeteria options, sensory-friendly spaces. If they won't comply, I'll find a school that will." "But Dad, what if that makes me even more different?" Christopher asked. "You are different," Richard said gently, "and that's not something to hide. Alice taught me that. She saw your difference not as a problem to fix, but as part of who you are. The world needs to learn to accommodate people like you, not the other way around." He turned to Alice. "And Alice, I've been thinking about you too. Your mother mentioned you're interested in science, that you love learning. How would you feel about some additional educational opportunities, tutoring, enrichment programs, maybe even—" "Mr. Bennett, we couldn't possibly," Maria began. "Yes, you could," Richard interrupted firmly. "Maria, Alice has a gift. That gift needs nurturing, regardless of which school she attends or how much money your family has. Let me help. not as charity, but as gratitude and investment in a remarkable young person. Maria looked at her daughter, saw the hope and intelligence shining in Alice's eyes, and felt something shift. Pride, yes, but also recognition that sometimes accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet," Maria said softly. "Thank you for seeing her." As October darkness fell outside the mansion windows, two families from different worlds shared a meal prepared in shades of purple, blue, and green. They talked about challenges and possibilities, about differences that made life harder but also richer, about the courage it takes to be authentically yourself in a world that demands conformity. Christopher had survived his first social test, though not without scars. Alice had discovered that bravery sometimes meant standing strong when people tried to make you feel small. And Richard had learned that protecting his son meant not just accommodating his differences, but teaching the world to value them. The road ahead would have more challenges, school days, more parties, inevitable moments when Christopher's condition would make life difficult. But now they faced those challenges together, this unlikely alliance of a billionaire CEO, his son with extraordinary perception, a devoted housekeeper, and a 6-year-old girl with the wisdom to see what others missed. As Alice and Maria drove home that night, Alice looked back at the mansion one last time. The windows glowed warm against the darkness, and somewhere inside Christopher was probably already asleep, exhausted but triumphant from his day. "Mama," Alice said quietly, "those girls at the party said mean things about us being different, but I don't think different is bad. I think different is just different." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's right, Mija, and sometimes being different is exactly what the world needs." Alice nodded, already thinking about Monday, about what challenges might come next, about how she and Christopher would face them together. She was 6 years old, wore Target dresses, and went to public school. But she had something those mean girls at the party would never have, the knowledge that true worth had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with the courage to see others truly, completely, exactly as they are. And in that knowledge, Alice Santos was richer than any mansion could ever make her. November brought cold winds, and the inevitable moment Richard had been both anticipating and dreading, Christopher's return to Riverside Academy. Despite Richard's best efforts to prepare the school, despite meetings with administrators and teachers, despite doctors' notes and accommodation plans, nothing could fully prepare Christopher for re-entering a world designed for normal children. The night before his first day back, Christopher couldn't sleep. Alice had come over for dinner, as she now did several times a week, and found him in his room, staring at his school uniform, navy blue pants and a white polo shirt, safe colors at least. "What if I mess up?" Christopher asked, his voice small. "What if I have a meltdown in front of everyone?" "Then you have a meltdown," Alice said practically, sitting on his bed, "and then it's over and you keep going. That's what my mama always says. You can't control everything, but you can control what you do after things go wrong." "You make it sound so easy," Christopher said. "It's not easy," Alice admitted. "Remember that party? When Madison was mean to me, I cried all the way home, but then I woke up the next day and you know what? I was still Alice. She couldn't take that away from me, no matter how hard she tried." Christopher managed a small smile. "You're pretty wise for 6 years old." "I learn from watching," Alice said. "That's my superpower. Yours is seeing colors different. We all have something special." The next morning, Richard drove Christopher to Riverside Academy personally, even though the mansion had a driver for such things. Some moments required a father, not an employee. As they pulled up to the prestigious school, with its manicured lawns and brick buildings, Christopher's breathing quickened. "Remember," Richard said, turning to face his son, "you have accommodations in place. Ms. Peterson knows about your condition. The cafeteria has been informed. You have permission to leave any classroom if the colors become overwhelming. And if anyone, student or teacher, gives you trouble, you call me immediately." "Okay," Christopher whispered, though his hand trembled on the door handle. "Christopher," Richard added, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm proud of you. Going back takes more courage than staying home ever would." Christopher nodded and stepped out of the car, his backpack heavy on his thin shoulders. The schoolyard was full of children, their colorful clothes and backpacks, a chaotic swirl that made Christopher's head hurt before he even reached the entrance. He kept his eyes on the ground, counting steps, using one of the techniques Dr. Rodriguez had taught him. His classroom was on the second floor. Ms. Peterson, his third-grade teacher, greeted him at the door with a warm smile. She was a kind woman in her 50s who'd taught at Riverside for 20 years and had actually read all the documentation Richard provided about synesthesia. "Welcome back, Christopher," she said gently. "Your desk is in the same spot near the window. I've made some adjustments based on your father's requests." Christopher entered the classroom and immediately noticed the changes. His desk area had been modified. The bright bulletin boards that used to surround his seat had been replaced with calmer blue and green displays. His supplies were organized in a purple bin instead of the red ones other students used. Small accommodations, but they mattered. But the other students noticed too. As Christopher took his seat, he heard the whispers. "Why does Christopher get special decorations?" "That's not fair. I want a purple bin too. My mum said he has some weird disease that makes him crazy." Miss Peterson clapped her hands. "Class, let's begin our morning meeting. Christopher, we're very glad to have you back. Would you like to share anything with the class about where you've been?" Christopher shook his head, his face burning. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to be different, didn't want everyone staring at him like he was some kind of science experiment. "That's fine," Ms. Peterson said smoothly. "Today we're going to continue our unit on geometry. Please take out your math workbooks." The morning proceeded relatively smoothly, until lunch. The cafeteria was Christopher's biggest fear. A massive room filled with hundreds of children, trays of food in every color imaginable, noise echoing off the walls. It was sensory overload, on a scale Christopher hadn't experienced since his crisis began. Richard had arranged for Christopher to have special meals, but even that drew attention. When Christopher sat down with his tray, containing purple cabbage salad, blueberries, and a sandwich on blue cornbread, the students around him stared. "What is that?" Tyler asked, wrinkling his nose. He was the same boy who'd been unkind at Ryan's party. "That looks disgusting." "It's just different food," Christopher mumbled, trying to make himself invisible. "Different like your weird disease?" Tyler pressed. "My dad says people who can't eat normal food are just attention seekers. He says your dad probably made up the whole thing, so you'd be special." Christopher felt his throat tighten. The cafeteria lights seemed too bright, the noise too loud, the smells too strong. The red apples on the lunch counter across the room felt like they were screaming at him, even from a distance. He was spiraling, and he knew it. "Christopher?" Ryan appeared at his side, sitting down with his own tray. "Hey, don't listen to Tyler. He's just mad because his dad lost that business deal with your dad last year. Want to hear about my new video game?" Ryan's kindness was a lifeline, and Christopher grabbed it. They talked about video games, about the upcoming Thanksgiving break, about anything except food and differences and attention-seeking. Christopher managed to eat most of his lunch, though his hands shook the entire time. But Tyler wasn't finished. As they were leaving the cafeteria, he deliberately bumped into Christopher, causing him to drop his tray. The purple cabbage splattered across the floor, and the noise of the falling tray echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared. Christopher stood frozen, looking at the mess, feeling hundreds of eyes on him. The bright red exit signs seemed to pulse with accusatory light. The orange safety posters on the walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't... "It's okay," Ryan said quickly, kneeling to help clean up. "Accidents happen." But Christopher was already backing away, his vision tunneling, his heart racing. This was it, the public meltdown he'd feared. He could feel it building, unstoppable as a wave. Then, impossibly, he heard a familiar voice. "Christopher, over here." He turned, and there was Alice, standing in the cafeteria doorway. She wasn't supposed to be there. Jefferson Elementary was across town. But somehow, impossibly, she was there, and her presence cut through his panic like a beam of light through fog. Alice ran to him, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers of, "Who is that girl?" She took his hand and led him out of the cafeteria, down the hallway to a quiet corner near the library. Only then did Christopher realize that Maria was there too, looking worried but determined. "Your dad called my mama," Alice explained, slightly out of breath. "He said today was your first day back, and asked if we could be nearby just in case. We've been in the parking lot all morning. You waited all morning?" Christopher asked, his breathing slowly returning to normal. "Just in case I needed you." "That's what friends do," Alice said simply. "Besides, I brought homework. I wasn't just sitting there doing nothing." Maria approached the school office to explain their presence, armed with a note from Richard giving her permission to be on campus. Meanwhile, Alice stayed with Christopher, talking him down from his panic, reminding him of his breathing exercises, being the steady presence that he needed. "Tyler's mean," Christopher said when he could finally speak. "He said my dad made up my condition for attention. Tyler's wrong," Alice said firmly. "And you know what? People like Tyler will always find something to be mean about. If it wasn't your synesthesia, it would be something else. Mean people don't need reasons. They just need targets." "But why does he target me?" "Because you're different in a way he doesn't understand," Alice explained, "and people are afraid of what they don't understand." "But Christopher, being different isn't wrong. Being mean about differences, that's what's wrong." Miss Peterson found them in the hallway, concern etched on her face. "Christopher, are you all right? The cafeteria monitor told me what happened." "I'm okay now," Christopher said, though his voice wavered. "This is my friend Alice. She helps me when things get overwhelming." Miss Peterson looked at Alice, this small girl from a different school, a different world, and saw something that made her smile. "Thank you for being here for Christopher, Alice. True friendship is a rare and precious thing." The rest of the school day was easier with Alice nearby. She waited in the library, doing her own schoolwork, available if Christopher needed her. He didn't call for her again, but knowing she was there gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. That evening, back at the mansion, Richard listened carefully as Christopher recounted his day. His expression darkened when he heard about Tyler's behavior. "I'll speak to the principal," Richard said firmly. "Bullying of any kind is unacceptable." "Dad, no," Christopher protested. "That'll just make it worse. Everyone will think I'm a tattletale who runs to his rich daddy to fix problems." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to use his influence and money to shield his son from every cruelty. But looking at Christopher's face, older somehow, more mature after just one day back at school, he realized his son was right. "Then what do you want to do?" Richard asked. Christopher thought for a moment. "I want to keep going. I want to show Tyler and everyone else that I'm not broken. Alice says being different isn't wrong. I think I need to believe that too." "That's very brave," Richard said quietly. "But Christopher, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." "Maybe not," Christopher agreed, "but I need to prove it to myself." Over the next few weeks, Christopher's return to school became easier, though never easy. He had good days and bad days. Some days, Tyler would leave him alone. Other days, the bullying was relentless, subtle enough that teachers didn't always catch it, but constant enough to wear Christopher down. But Alice was always there, sometimes physically, sitting in the library on particularly hard days. Sometimes just in spirit, her words echoing in Christopher's mind when he felt overwhelmed. Being different isn't wrong. One afternoon in late November, something changed. Christopher was in art class, one of his favorite subjects despite the explosion of colors that art rooms always contained. The assignment was to create a self-portrait using any medium they chose. Most students drew realistic pictures or used photographs. But Christopher did something different. He created an abstract piece, swirls of blue and purple and green, with small stabs of red and orange on the edges, representing how colors felt to him rather than how they looked. In the center, he painted a small figure surrounded by chaos, but standing steady. His teacher, Mr. Hammond, was speechless. "Christopher, this is remarkable. It's not what I expected, but it's powerful. Would you be willing to explain it to the class?" Christopher's first instinct was to refuse, but then he thought about Alice's courage at Ryan's party, how she'd stood up and explained synesthesia to a room full of strangers. If she could do that, maybe he could do this. "It's about how I see the world," Christopher said, his voice quiet but growing stronger. "I have synesthesia. It means my brain processes colors differently than yours. Some colors feel loud and overwhelming to me. Others feel peaceful. This painting shows what the inside of my head feels like." The classroom was silent. Then Ryan spoke up. "That's actually really cool, Christopher. It's like you experience things we can't even imagine. It's like a superpower," another student, Emma, added. "You see the world in a way none of us can." Not everyone was convinced. Tyler rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath, but something shifted in that room. Christopher wasn't just the weird kid with the strange food requirements. He was an artist with a unique perspective. He was someone who experienced the world in an extraordinary way. That evening, Christopher couldn't wait to tell Alice about the art class. She'd already gone home, but he video-called her, something Richard had set up so the two friends could stay connected even when apart. "They understood," Christopher said, his face glowing on Alice's small screen. "Well, not everyone, but some of them did. Emma said synesthesia was like a superpower." "It is a superpower," Alice said. "I told you that from the beginning, remember?" "You did," Christopher agreed. "Alice, I don't think I would have made it through these weeks without you. You're more than my friend. You're like my person, the one who gets me when nobody else does." Alice smiled, though Christopher couldn't see the tears forming in her eyes. In her small bedroom, in her small apartment, she felt the full weight of what their friendship meant. She was 6 years old, and somehow had become essential to a 7-year-old boy from a completely different world. "You're my person too," Alice said softly. "No matter what happens, Christopher, we're a team. Always." "Always," Christopher echoed. As November drew to a close, Christopher had survived his return to school. He'd faced bullying, panic attacks, and moments of profound doubt. But he'd also discovered something crucial. He was stronger than he thought. His difference wasn't a weakness to hide, it was part of who he was, and there were people who could see the beauty in that difference. The road ahead still held challenges. Thanksgiving was coming, with family gatherings and meals full of traditionally colored foods. Winter break would follow, then a new semester with new situations to navigate. But Christopher faced the future with something he hadn't had before. Not just accommodation for his difference, but acceptance of it. And beside him, every step of the way, was Alice, his translator, his champion, his friend who saw him not despite his differences, but because of them. Together, they were learning that the world didn't have to change to make room for people like Christopher. Sometimes, people like Christopher changed the world simply by being brave enough to exist in it, exactly as they were. In his room that night, Christopher looked at his abstract painting, now displayed prominently on his wall. The swirls of color that used to frighten him looked different now, not threatening but powerful. They were his colors, his vision, his truth. And for the first time since his mother died, Christopher Bennett felt something approaching peace. Not because his condition had changed, but because he had. He'd stopped trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for him, and started building his own world instead. One where different wasn't wrong, where unique was valuable, where a little boy with synesthesia and a little girl with extraordinary perception could change each other's lives simply by seeing the truth in one another. That Christopher was beginning to understand was the real superpower, not the synesthesia itself, but the courage to be authentic in a world that demanded conformity, and the wisdom to recognize that courage in others, whether they wore designer clothes or Target dresses, whether they went to private schools or public ones. The world was full of colors, some loud, some quiet, some painful, some peaceful. But with the right person beside you, even the loudest colors became bearable. Even the hardest days became survivable. And sometimes, just sometimes, they even became beautiful. Thanksgiving week arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned the mansion's windows into frames of frost. For most families, it was a time of gratitude and togetherness. For Christopher, it represented his greatest challenge yet, a full day surrounded by extended family he hadn't seen since before his mother's death, all gathered for a traditional meal that would be a minefield of triggering colors. Richard's parents, Robert and Catherine Bennett, were flying in from Connecticut. His sister, Amanda, would be driving from Boston with her husband and 2 teenage children. None of them had seen Christopher during his crisis. None of them truly understood what synesthesia meant. And Richard knew with a sinking certainty that they would have opinions. The night before Thanksgiving, Richard found Christopher in the library, surrounded by books about famous people with synesthesia. Dr. Rodriguez had suggested this, showing Christopher that his condition was shared by artists, musicians, and scientists throughout history, that he wasn't alone or broken. "Hey, buddy," Richard said, settling into the chair beside his son. "Tomorrow's going to be intense. How are you feeling about it?" Christopher closed his book, a biography of composer Franz Liszt, who reportedly saw colors when he heard music. "Nervous," he admitted. "Grandma and Grandpa don't really believe in differences being okay." "Remember how they were about Mom wanting to work instead of staying home?" Richard winced. His parents were old-fashioned, rigid in their views about how things should be. Sarah had always said they meant well, but existed in a different era, one where conformity was valued above authenticity. "They love you," Richard said carefully. They don't always understand things that are outside their experience." "Will Alice be here?" Christopher asked hopefully. "If she wants to be," Richard said. "I've invited Maria and Alice to join us for dinner. Your grandmother might have opinions about that too, but this is our home, and Alice is family to us." Christopher's face brightened. "Really? Alice can come to Thanksgiving?" "Of course," Richard said, "though I should warn you, it's going to be a traditional meal. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, all the colors that are difficult for you. We'll have your special food prepared, but you'll be the only one eating it." "I know," Christopher said quietly. "But if Alice is there, I can handle it." What Christopher didn't know was that Alice had her own reservations about Thanksgiving at the mansion. That evening in the Santos apartment, Maria was having a difficult conversation with her daughter. "Mija, are you sure you want to go?" Maria asked, braiding Alice's hair before bed. "It's going to be very fancy people, very formal, not like our Thanksgivings." "I want to go," Alice insisted. "Christopher needs me." "I know he does," Maria said gently. "But Alice, Mr. Bennett's family, they might not be as kind as he is. They might say things that hurt your feelings, like those girls at the party." "I don't care," Alice said. though her voice wavered slightly. "Christopher is my best friend. I'm not going to leave him alone just because some people might be mean." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride and concern in equal measure. Her daughter was so brave, so loyal. But Maria knew the world could be cruel to people who didn't fit its narrow definitions of belonging. "Okay," Maria agreed, "but remember, you are Alice Santos. You are valuable and worthy, no matter what anyone says or thinks. Never forget that." Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and cold. The mansion's kitchen was chaos. Caterers preparing the traditional feast, while Richard's personal chef worked on Christopher's safe-colored alternatives. Maria arrived early to help coordinate, bringing Alice, who wore a simple green dress that Maria had sewn herself. The Bennett family began arriving at noon. Robert and Catherine came first, their expensive car pulling up with the kind of precision that suggested they'd never been late for anything in their lives. Robert was tall and severe, with silver hair and the same sharp features Richard had inherited. Catherine was elegant in pearls and cashmere, her smile warm, but her eyes assessing. "Richard," Robert said, shaking his son's hand rather than hugging him, "the house looks well." "Thank you, Dad," Richard replied. "Christopher's excited to see you both." But when Christopher appeared at the top of the stairs, Catherine's gasp was audible. "Oh, Richard, he's so thin. Has he been eating at all?" "He's been eating," Richard said firmly. "He had some medical challenges, but he's recovering. Please don't make a big deal about it. It might upset him." Christopher descended the stairs slowly, feeling his grandparents' scrutiny like a physical weight. When he reached the bottom, Catherine pulled him into a perfumed embrace that made him hold his breath. "My darling boy," she said, "we've been so worried. Your father said you were ill?" "I'm better now," Christopher said, extracting himself from the hug as politely as possible. "Well, wait until you taste the dinner we have planned," Robert said jovially. "Your grandmother made sure the caterers prepared all your favorites. Turkey with all the trimmings, just like your mother used to make." Christopher's stomach clenched. His mother's Thanksgiving meals had been beautiful. Golden turkey, orange sweet potatoes, red cranberry sauce. All the colors that now caused him physical discomfort. Before he could respond, Amanda arrived with her family. His aunt immediately swept him into another overwhelming hug, while his teenage cousins, Blake and Olivia, gave him awkward waves from a distance, already absorbed in their phones. The house filled with noise and activity. Adults talked over each other, sharing news and gossip. The teenagers claimed the game room. And Christopher stood in the middle of it all, feeling increasingly overwhelmed, but trying to maintain composure. Then Alice appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of appetizers Maria had prepared. She was trying to be helpful, to stay out of the way, to be invisible in the way children from working families learn to be in wealthy spaces. Catherine noticed her immediately. "And who is this?" "That's Alice," Christopher said quickly, moving to stand beside his friend. "She's Maria's daughter. Maria is our housekeeper." "Oh," Catherine said, the single syllable loaded with meaning. "How nice that she could join us." The way Catherine said nice made it clear she thought it was anything but. Alice felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her head high, remembering her mother's words. "You are Alice Santos. You are valuable and worthy." "Alice is Christopher's friend," Richard interjected firmly. "She's been instrumental in his recovery. We're grateful to have both her and Maria with us today." "Of course," Catherine said smoothly, though her expression suggested otherwise. "It's very modern of you, Richard, to blur the lines between family and staff." The afternoon grew more tense as dinner time approached. Christopher retreated to his room, Alice following to keep him company. Through his bedroom window, they could see the dining room being set, the table covered in fall decorations, orange pumpkins and red leaves and golden candles. Beautiful to most eyes, torture to Christopher's. "I don't know if I can do this," Christopher admitted, his voice breaking. It's not just the food, it's everything. Grandma's already disappointed in me, I can tell, and the way she looked at you. Alice, I'm sorry. I should have warned you better. It's not your fault your grandmother is snobbish, Alice said practically. My mama says some people think money makes them better than others, but it doesn't. It just makes them richer. Christopher managed a small laugh. You always know what to say. That's because I pay attention, Alice said. And I'm paying attention now, and I see that you're scared. But Christopher, you've already survived so much. You survived not eating for 3 weeks. You survived going back to school. You survived Tyler being mean every single day. You can survive one Thanksgiving dinner. But what if I can't eat anything? What if I have a panic attack in front of everyone? Then you have a panic attack, Alice said, echoing her earlier advice. And it will be uncomfortable, and your grandmother might clutch her pearls, but it will end. And tomorrow you'll wake up, and you'll still be Christopher, and I'll still be Alice, and we'll still be friends. A knock on the door interrupted them. Maria entered, looking worried. Christopher, your father says it's time for dinner. Are you ready? Christopher took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. The dining room was exactly as overwhelming as Christopher had feared. The massive table was laden with traditional Thanksgiving dishes: golden brown turkey, orange sweet potato casserole, red cranberry sauce, brown gravy, yellow corn, green bean casserole with brown fried onions on top. A rainbow of food, each color competing for attention, each one screaming at Christopher's heightened senses. At the head of the table, a separate plate had been prepared for Christopher: purple cabbage, blueberries, grapes, and blue cornbread. It looked strange and sparse next to the abundance surrounding it. What on earth is that? Catherine asked as Christopher sat down. Richard, why does Christopher have different food? I told you, Mother, Richard said patiently. Christopher has sensory sensitivities. He needs to eat foods within a specific color palette. Color palette? Robert scoffed. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The boy needs discipline, not accommodation. In my day, children ate what was put in front of them. Dad, it's not about discipline, Richard said, his voice tight. It's a neurological condition called synesthesia. It's real, it's documented, and it's not something Christopher can control. Synesthesia, Catherine repeated, making it sound like a dirty word. Richard, I've been reading about this new parenting trend. Parents inventing conditions to explain away normal childhood behavior. Is that what this is? Christopher felt his throat closing. His grandmother thought he was making it up, thought he was just being difficult. The colors on the table seemed to pulse and throb, the oranges growing brighter, the reds more aggressive. It's not made up, Alice said suddenly, her voice clear in the tense silence. Christopher has a special brain. He sees colors different than we do. Some colors hurt him, like how bright lights hurt your eyes when you're not expecting them. It's real. Catherine turned to look at Alice, really look at her for the first time. And you are qualified to make this diagnosis, young lady? No, Alice admitted, but I'm qualified to believe my friend when he tells me something hurts. That's called being kind. The table fell silent. Amanda's teenagers looked up from their phones, suddenly interested. Maria looked terrified that her daughter had just talked back to Catherine Bennett. Richard looked like he was trying not to smile. Catherine's face flushed. Well, I see Richard has allowed his son to be influenced by some very modern ideas about respect. Mother, Richard said, his voice dangerous now. Alice is a guest in my home. She is Christopher's dear friend. And she's right, synesthesia is real. Christopher's experience is valid, and I won't have it dismissed at this table. Fine, Catherine said coldly. Then perhaps we should simply eat in silence, since apparently everything I say is wrong. The meal proceeded in excruciating awkwardness. Christopher tried to eat his safe-colored food, but his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his fork. Alice sat beside him, having been given permission to sit at the main table rather than with the staff, though Catherine's disapproval radiated like heat. Halfway through the meal, Amanda tried to lighten the mood. "So, Christopher, your father tells me you're quite the artist, creating abstract paintings." "Yes," Christopher said quietly. "I did a self-portrait that Mr. Hammond really liked." "That's wonderful," Amanda said genuinely. "I'd love to see it sometime." "It's weird," Olivia muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Mum, can we please just eat and go? This is so uncomfortable." "Olivia," Amanda admonished, but the damage was done. Christopher's vision tunneled. The room felt too small, too loud, too colourful. His heart raced, his breathing quickened. He was going to have a panic attack right here, in front of everyone, proving his grandmother right, that he was just being dramatic, just seeking attention. "Excuse me," he gasped, standing abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. I can't." He ran from the room, leaving stunned silence behind him. Alice immediately jumped up to follow, but Maria grabbed her arm. "Let his father go," Maria whispered. "It's not your responsibility." But Alice pulled free and ran after Christopher anyway. She found him in the library, curled up in his favorite chair, crying so hard he couldn't catch his breath. "Christopher, breathe," Alice said, kneeling in front of him. "Look at me, just at me. Count with me, okay? 1, 2, 3. Slowly, Christopher's breathing normalized, his sobs quieted, but the humiliation remained, thick and choking. "They think I'm making it up," he whispered. "My own grandparents think I'm a liar." "They're wrong," Alice said fiercely. "And you know what? Their opinion doesn't matter. You know your truth. Your dad knows it. I know it. The doctors know it. Your grandparents not understanding doesn't make it less real." Back in the dining room, Richard was having his own confrontation. "Mother, Dad, I need you to understand something. Christopher has been through hell this year. He lost his mother. He almost starved himself to death because his brain works differently and no one understood. He's the bravest person I know, and I won't have him made to feel ashamed for something he can't control." "We're not trying to shame him," Robert said, though he sounded less certain now. "We just don't understand this. Synesthesia. In our day, children were resilient. They adapted." "Christopher is adapting," Richard said. "Every single day, he adapts to a world that isn't built for him. But he shouldn't have to do it alone, and he shouldn't have to do it without support from his own family." Catherine looked toward the library, where Christopher's sobs had been audible moments before. Something in her expression softened, just slightly. Perhaps I was too hasty in my judgment. I just want what's best for the boy." "Then believe him," Richard said simply. "That's what's best. Believe him when he says something hurts. Trust that his experience is real, even if you can't fully understand it." In the library, Christopher had calmed enough to talk. "I'm sorry, Alice. I ruined Thanksgiving." "You didn't ruin anything," Alice said. "Your grandmother's attitude ruined it. But you know what? We can make our own Thanksgiving, just you and me. We'll list what we're grateful for." "Okay," Christopher said, wiping his eyes. "I'm grateful for you, for understanding me." "I'm grateful for you too," Alice said. "For showing me that being different is brave, for being my first real friend." They sat together in the quiet library, away from the tension of the dining room, creating their own moment of Thanksgiving. And slowly, Christopher realized something important. He didn't need his grandparents' approval or understanding. It would be nice, certainly. But it wasn't necessary for him to know his own worth. Eventually, Richard found them. "Christopher, your grandparents would like to speak with you, if you're ready." Christopher looked at Alice, who nodded encouragingly. Together they returned to the dining room, where Catherine and Robert sat looking uncomfortable and somewhat chastened. "Christopher," Catherine began, her voice softer than before, "I owe you an apology. I didn't understand about your condition. I thought—" She paused, struggling with words. I thought you were simply being difficult. I can see now that I was wrong. We don't fully understand this synesthesia, Robert added gruffly. But your father has explained that it's real and that it's been difficult for you. We should have been more supportive. It wasn't a perfect apology. It still carried the suggestion that Christopher's experience was strange, other, something requiring explanation. But it was a start, an acknowledgement that their initial response had been wrong. "Thank you," Christopher said quietly. "I know it's hard to understand. Sometimes I don't understand it myself, but it's part of who I am." The rest of the evening was less tense, though not entirely comfortable. Catherine made an effort to ask Christopher about his art, really listening to his answers. Robert engaged him in a conversation about school that didn't center on Christopher's differences. Small steps, but meaningful ones. As the family began leaving, as the mansion settled back into quiet, Christopher found himself exhausted, but not defeated. He'd survived. More than that, he'd stood his ground. He'd refused to pretend his experience wasn't real, even when people he loved questioned it. Later that night, as Maria and Alice prepared to go home, Richard pulled them aside. "Thank you both for being here today. Alice, what you said to my mother about being kind, meaning believing your friend, that was profound. You're a remarkable young lady." Alice ducked her head, embarrassed but pleased. "I just said what was true." "The truth isn't always easy to speak," Richard said, "especially to people with power over you. You have more courage than most adults I know." As Alice and Maria drove home through the cold November night, Alice thought about courage, about truth, about the price of being different in a world that demanded sameness. She thought about Christopher, fighting his own battles in his mansion fortress. And she thought about her own future, about how she might use her gift for seeing truth to help not just Christopher, but others who needed someone to believe them. "Mama," Alice asked quietly, "do you think Christopher will be okay?" "I think," Maria said carefully, "that Christopher has something many people never find, a friend who truly sees him. That's worth more than all the money in that mansion." Alice nodded, satisfied. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the mansion's lights disappear behind them, knowing she'd be back soon. Because that's what friends did. They showed up, they believed, they stood beside each other, even when the world suggested they shouldn't, couldn't, didn't belong together. And in that showing up, that believing, that standing together, that's where real Thanksgiving lived. Not in perfect meals or family harmony or traditional celebrations, but in the messy, complicated, beautiful act of seeing another person's truth and saying, "I believe you. I'm here. You're not alone." Christopher stood at his bedroom window, watching Alice's car disappear into the night, feeling that same truth settle in his bones. He wasn't alone. Whatever challenges came next, and there would be challenges, he wouldn't face them alone, and somehow that made even the loudest colors bearable. December brought snow to the city, transforming the world into shades of white and blue, Christopher's favorite colors. It had been nearly 3 months since Alice's discovery, and Christopher had changed in ways that went beyond physical recovery. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from truly accepting who he was. But the biggest change was yet to come. One cold afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez arrived at the mansion with unexpected news. She'd been collaborating with researchers at Johns Hopkins, and they wanted to feature Christopher's case in a medical study about synesthesia in children. "More than that," Dr. Rodriguez explained, as Richard, Christopher, and Alice listened intently. "They want Christopher to speak at a children's neurology conference in March, to share his experience with other doctors and families dealing with similar conditions." Christopher's eyes widened. "Speak? In front of people? About my synesthesia?" "Only if you want to," Dr. Rodriguez assured him. "But Christopher, Your story could help so many children who are struggling to be understood. You could be a voice for kids who don't have one." Richard looked at his son with concern. "That's a lot of pressure, buddy. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." But Alice saw something in Christopher's expression, not fear, but possibility. "I think you should do it," she said quietly. "Think about how alone you felt before anyone understood. You could help other kids not feel that way." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he said something that surprised everyone. "I want to do it, but only if Alice can come with me." "Christopher, I can't speak at a medical conference," Alice protested. "I'm 6 years old, I'm not a doctor." "But you're the one who figured it out," Christopher insisted. "You saw what trained professionals missed. That's part of the story, that sometimes understanding comes from just paying attention, from believing someone instead of trying to fix them." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Actually, Alice, Christopher's right. Your perspective would be invaluable. How you observed and listened without the filter of medical training, that's something doctors need to hear." Over the next 3 months, something remarkable happened. Christopher and Alice prepared for the conference together, with Dr. Rodriguez's guidance. They practiced speaking, learned to articulate Christopher's experience in ways that would help others understand, and in the process, both children discovered gifts they didn't know they possessed. Christopher learned he had a talent for explaining complex sensory experiences in simple terms. Alice discovered she could connect with audiences, making medical concepts accessible through storytelling. But more importantly, their friendship deepened into something that transcended their different backgrounds. In the Bennett Mansion's library, a working-class 6-year-old girl and a wealthy 7-year-old boy became partners in a mission larger than themselves. Helping other children who felt broken or misunderstood realize they weren't alone. School had become easier for Christopher. Word had spread about the upcoming conference presentation, and suddenly his synesthesia wasn't just weird, it was interesting. Even Tyler had backed off, perhaps realizing that Christopher wasn't an easy target anymore. Ryan remained Christopher's loyal friend, but Alice had become something more, a collaborator, a co-creator of change. The night before they left for the conference in Baltimore, Richard gathered everyone in the mansion's living room, Maria, Alice, Christopher, and even Dr. Rodriguez. "I want to say something," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion. 6 months ago, I thought I was losing my son. I threw money at the problem, hired the best specialists, tried everything except the one thing that actually mattered, listening, really listening. He looked at Alice. Then this remarkable little girl showed up and did what I couldn't. She saw Christopher not as a problem to solve, but as a person to understand. And in doing that, she didn't just save his life, she changed it, changed all our lives. "Mr. Bennett," Maria said softly, "Alice just did what any kind person would do." "No," Richard disagreed gently. "Most people don't do what Alice did. Most people assume expertise knows best. Alice trusted her observations, trusted Christopher's truth, and had the courage to act on that trust. That's extraordinary." He turned to Christopher. "And you, buddy, watching you transform from a boy who couldn't eat to someone about to speak at a medical conference, I couldn't be more proud. You took your greatest challenge and turned it into your greatest strength." Christopher smiled, though tears glistened in his eyes. "I couldn't have done any of it without Alice. We're a team." "The best team," Alice agreed, reaching for Christopher's hand. The conference was overwhelming in the best possible way. Hundreds of doctors, researchers, and families filled the auditorium. When Christopher and Alice walked onto the stage, Christopher in his blue suit and Alice in her purple dress, they looked so small under the bright lights. But when they began to speak, something magical happened. Christopher's voice, though quiet, carried truth that resonated through the room. He explained how colors felt to him, not just looked, but felt, how red was like shouting, orange like alarm bells, but blue was like a gentle whisper. Then Alice shared her perspective, how she'd simply watched and wondered, how she'd asked questions instead of making assumptions, how she'd believed Christopher when he said the food was screaming at him, even though that didn't make logical sense to her 6-year-old understanding. "I think grown-ups forget to just believe kids sometimes," Alice said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident. "They think they have to understand everything perfectly before they can help. But sometimes you just have to believe that someone's telling the truth about their own experience, even if it's different from yours." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Then Alice said something that would later be quoted in medical journals and parenting books. "Christopher taught me that different isn't broken, and I think maybe the world needs to learn that too." When they finished, the applause was thunderous. Doctors stood, families wept, and Christopher and Alice looked at each other with matching expressions of wonder. They'd done it. They'd shared their truth, and people had listened. After the presentation, families approached them. Parents of children with synesthesia, with sensory processing disorders, with differences that made the world difficult to navigate. They thanked Christopher for making them feel less alone. They thanked Alice for reminding them to trust their children's experiences. One mother, tears streaming down her face, knelt before Alice. "My daughter has been trying to tell me that numbers have colors for 2 years. I thought she was being creative, making things up. But hearing you talk about believing Christopher, I realize I haven't been believing her. Thank you for showing me how to listen." On the plane ride home, Christopher and Alice sat together, exhausted but exhilarated. Richard watched them from across the aisle, marveling at what these two small humans had accomplished. "Alice," Christopher said quietly, "do you ever think about how different our lives would be if your mom didn't work at my house, if we'd never met?" "All the time," Alice admitted. "I think about how I wouldn't have a best friend who gets me, how you might still be struggling alone." "It's weird, right?" Christopher continued. "How something so random, like who someone's mom works for, can change everything." "Maybe it's not random," Alice suggested. "Maybe we were supposed to meet. Maybe you needed someone who could see you clearly, and I needed someone who could teach me that being different is okay." Christopher considered this. "Like we saved each other?" "Exactly like that," Alice said. The weeks following the conference brought unexpected changes. The research team at Johns Hopkins wanted to continue studying Christopher's case. Other schools reached out to Riverside Academy, asking about their accommodations for students with synesthesia. Richard was approached by organizations wanting to fund research into sensory processing differences. But the most meaningful change happened quietly, in small moments. Christopher navigating the world with increasing confidence, Alice discovering a passion for advocacy and science, their friendship growing deeper, more resilient, proving that connection transcends circumstance. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after Alice's initial discovery, they sat together in the mansion's garden, now planted specifically with flowers in Christopher's safe colors: purple irises, blue hydrangeas, green herbs. "I've been thinking," Christopher said, "about what I want to be when I grow up. I think maybe I want to help other kids like me, be like Dr. Rodriguez, but someone who actually has synesthesia, someone who really gets it." "That's perfect," Alice said. "You'd be amazing at that." "What about you?" Christopher asked. "What do you want to be?" Alice was quiet for a moment, watching a blue butterfly land on a purple iris. "I think I want to be a doctor too, but the kind who listens to what kids say about their own bodies and minds, the kind who believes people." "We could do it together," Christopher suggested. "Be a team, like always." "Like always," Alice agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, two children who'd found each other against all odds and changed each other's lives in the process. The world around them was full of colors. some loud, some quiet, some painful, some peaceful. But together, they'd learn to navigate that world, not by changing who they were, but by accepting it fully. Richard watched them from the library window, his heart full. He thought about Sarah, about how proud she would be of their son, how she would have loved Alice's fierce spirit and kind heart, how she would have understood, better than he initially did, that the greatest gifts often come disguised as challenges. Christopher had lost so much. His mother, his sense of safety, weeks of his life to a condition no one understood. But in losing, he'd also found strength he didn't know he possessed, found a friendship that transcended every boundary society tried to impose, found his voice and his purpose. And Alice, who'd come to the mansion as the housekeeper's daughter, had discovered that her gift for observation and her capacity for empathy were powerful tools, that her perspective mattered, that she could change lives simply by paying attention and choosing to believe. As spring faded into summer, their story continued, not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet promise of ongoing friendship, growth, and purpose. Christopher still had hard days, moments when the world's colors overwhelmed him. Alice still faced prejudice from people who judged her by her economic status rather than her character. But they faced these challenges together, two unlikely friends who'd learned the most important lesson of all, that our differences aren't weaknesses to overcome or secrets to hide. They're strengths to celebrate, truths to honor, gifts that make us exactly who we're meant to be. And sometimes, just sometimes, those differences allow us to see what others miss, to help in ways others can't, to change lives in ways we never imagined possible. Christopher Bennett and Alice Santos, a boy who saw colors differently and a girl who saw people truly, proved that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or status or expertise. It's the simple, profound act of one person believing in another, of seeing someone's truth and saying, "I see you, I hear you, you're not alone." That belief, that seeing, that refusal to let anyone feel invisible or invalid, that's what changed everything. And that's a superpower anyone can possess, if they choose to use it.